Everybody's talking about shoegaze these days. TikTok edits, indie playlists, bands with Wolf's reverb, but what is shoegaze really? And why did it collapse because of Britpop invasion? Nowadays, its influence can be seen in visual culture and even in R&B music, but things weren't so simple for the genre at the start.
If you're into rock music, especially the 90s, you've probably heard the term before. Maybe you're even a hardcore shoegaze fan and know the genre way better than I do. But don't worry, I'm not a teacher, class is over, and we're not here for a lecture. We're just here to quickly sum up the history of the genre, which honestly hasn't changed all that dramatically over the last 30 years. You're watching Lesser Bureau YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe, share, and please watch until the end. It really helps with the algorithm. And I promise, it won't take you long. I'm going to tell you how the genre formed, how it failed to compete with grunge in the 1990s, and what the top 3 shoegaze albums are.
So when we talk about shoegaze, we're actually talking about something that was, in many ways, created by journalists. It's just convenient to have one word that describes a group of similar sounding bands, even if they aren't completely similar. And shoegaze has nothing to do with some weird hobby of staring at your brand new shoes or at someone else's shoes. The term was linked to Andy Ross, a music executive who studied social history. He loved music, worked in record shops, and went to see cult bands live, like Blur and other 90s classics. Just like with post-punk. By the way, check out my previous video. Shoegaze was also connected to the British music press. Back then it was kind of like a mix between Pitchfork and Reddit. Conspiracy maybe, or maybe not. Anyway, Andy Ross, who at the time owned Food Records, the label that released early Blur singles, also wrote about modern bands. Somewhere around 1990 or 1991 he described bands like Moose, whose members often looked down at their effects pedals during performances as shoegazing artists. It was just a joke. But soon things got serious. Music journalists like Steve Lemach began using the term in NME, and by May 25, 1991, shoegaze was officially out in the world. Ross later said Lemach wasn't really the person who invented the term, and some people think Ross got the dates wrong. But honestly, who cares? Shoegaze was born. What's funny is that the original shoegaze bands didn't even have that much to do with complex pedal setups. As Moose's guitarist later explained, the vocalist was actually looking down because he was reading lyrics sheets on the floor, since he couldn't remember the words. But Ross insisted they were shoegazing.
And as often happens, once the term existed, many older bands were suddenly reclassified as shoegaze too, like the 1980s underground heroes the Jesus and Mary Chain. So now let's figure it out, who exactly taught the 90s kids to shoegaze.
I think we can take the psychedelia of the 1960s as a turning point in the future evolution of rock. It was the time when bands such as Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, Silver Apples, Pink Floyd, and others started experimenting with sound. They were heavily influenced by world music, especially Indian raga, used new pedal equipment and fresh recording tools, early tape-driven samplers and synthesizers, classical instruments, and different vocal techniques. Shoegaze is all about pedals. Without them, you simply won't reach the right sound. Basically, you can play the same kinds of chords that any other 60s band used, like the Rolling Stones or the Beatles, but with special equipment, you'll get that shining, glimmering, and pulsating wall of sound. So what does every shoegazer need? Usually these pedals are mentioned as absolute essentials. Fuzz, modulators, reverb and delay, overdrive, chorus and flanger are also frequently included. Fuzz was one of the first guitar pedals ever invented. Arbiter Electronics Limited issued the Fuzz Face in 1966, and it marked the beginning of hard rock and psychedelic rock. Jimi Hendrix was among the guitarists who popularized fuzz during his concerts. Delay is essential to shoegaze. It makes your guitar sound massive, echoing and dreamy. This effect was used in studio experimentation during the 1940s and 1950s and was later implemented in rockabilly. At first, it required complex and expensive tape delay machines, such as the original Echoplex, the Space Echo, and the Multi-Echo. Then, in 1969, Philips Research invented the BBD chipset, and the Boss DD2 became the first digital compact delay pedal, released in 1983. Of course, early reverb equipment was analog, and it could also make a guitar sound huge and immersive. The first dedicated digital reverb pedal was released in 1987, bringing digital reverb technology into a compact, foot-operated unit. The Electro-Harmonix Electric Mistress was the first standalone flanger pedal, designed by David Cockerell in 1975-1976. And speaking of chorus, Bass were pioneers too. The Bass Chorus Ensemble was introduced by Roland in June 1976 and became the first compact chorus unit. As for overdrive and other heavy-sounding pedals, you can easily say that the Fuzzface was the father of them all.
So, by the 1980s, everything technically was ready for shoegaze to occur. Since psychedelic rock was already mentioned, I would also like to highlight the impact of the wall of sound, invented by producer and songwriter Phil Spector in the early 1960s, while recording with pop groups.
This technique incorporated an expanded rhythm section, keyboard, several percussive instruments, woodwind, brass, and string sections. The music was also reinforced through doubling, when two or more instruments play in unison. The Walker Brothers and Dusty Springfield were among the musicians who used the wall of sound in their tracks. It's crazy, but Phil Spector made history not only as a genius producer, but also as a criminal. Let's consider it this way. The Velvet Underground, the Beatles, goth and post-punk all helped shape shoegaze. Members of Slowdive have spoken about loving the emotional distance and atmosphere of post-punk, while Kevin Shields has credited the influence of American underground noise bands like Sonic Youth and indie rock pioneers such as Dinosaur Jr. German groups like Ken and Noy gave shoegaze its straightforward, driving rhythm, while Jimi Hendrix and Pink Floyd taught musicians how to build entire dreamlike worlds out of guitars. And of course, 60s pop contributed the classic songwriting formula, bright melodies and catchy hooks buried under layers of sound. And finally, the Jesus and Mary chain were absolutely essential to the genre.
The next big question is how shoegaze grew out of dream pop, and what the main difference between the genres really is. Cocteau Twins are often described as one of the first dream pop bands in history.
The group was formed in Scotland in 1979 by guitarist Robin Guthrie and bass player Will Haggie. They were heavily influenced by post-punk and goth, and journalists at the time often compared them to Bauhaus, Joy Division, and Susie and the Banshees. A key part of their approach was their lack of formal playing experience, so instead of focusing on traditional melodies, they experimented with textures and atmosphere. Their early tracks sounded heavy and gloomy. Cocteau Twins were deeply connected with romanticism and symbolism, almost continuing these artistic movements through music. In 1982, the band signed with the label 4AD and released their debut album Garlands, which Billboard described as dark post-punk. And it truly was. Garlands relied on drum machines, groovy bass lines, and ethereal vocals. The band themselves were unhappy with the final result, and the media kept comparing them to Susie and the Banshees. When Will Haggie left after the first album, the sound of Cocteau Twins began to change. Head Over Heels, in 1983, showed a clear shift toward a more hazy, dreamlike style. In fact, Guthrie later cited Phil Spector's Wall of Sound as an influence on his approach. By the time of Victorialand, the band's music had become even more airy and abstract. This evolution shows how dream pop and shoegaze were forming almost simultaneously. Dream pop was softer and less noisy, while shoegaze would become heavier, louder, and more aggressive.
Around the same time Cocteau Twins were shaping their unique sound, another band was gaining attention, My Bloody Valentine.
It took them years to form their unique sound, which later defined shoegaze. My Bloody Valentine was formed in 1983 in Ireland by Kevin Shields, Colm O'Keefe, Debbie Gooch and Belinda Butcher. The musicians absorbed many influences of their time, including Dinosaur Jr., Sonic Youth, The Smiths, Spaceman 3 and Jesus and Mary Chain. Their 1980s EPs such as Ecstasy, You Made Me Realize and Feed Me With Your Kiss were crucial steps in shaping their sound. Shields drew heavily on 1960s psychedelic rock by the Byrds and the Beatles, using loops, 12-string electric guitar and borrowing from twee-pop and gothic rock aesthetics. Shoegaze seems to have been born out of this strange alliance when the 1960s met gothic romanticism and indie rock noisiness. On the way to their peak, My Bloody Valentine released their debut album Isn't Anything in 1988. With the opening track Soft as Snow but Warm Inside, you can clearly hear the hovering and abstract guitar textures in the background. This was essential for shoegaze. In fact, this guitar sound became a cornerstone of the entire genre. Shields' technique of shimmering ambient guitar defined what countless bands would later try to copy. Kevin Shields' guitar sound is built on simplicity of playing and constant movement of sound rather than complex technique. He avoids complicated chords, sticking mostly to simple bar shapes inspired by Johnny Ramone. His right hand works almost mechanically, while his left hand forms basic shapes that become expressive through other means. The real key to his sound is the Jazzmaster tremolo arm, which he uses continuously and almost subconsciously. Shields bends the arm only downward as a constant, flowing motion that creates a direct connection between his hand, the strings, and the amplifier. This pitch modulation actually changes the frequency balance and how the amp responds, meaning the sound is always shifting. For Shields, guitar playing itself is a part of sound design. The tremolo arm, combined with heavy effects like reverse reverb, turns simple chords into something fluid, blurred, and moving. As a teenager around 1980-1981, I used to buy a lot of punk records, such as Crass and Cockney Rejects, which followed the original punk format. I walked into the bedroom alone and listened to it very relaxed. It was nice to lie down on the bed, put my feet up on the radiator and listen to music. I was dozing off all the time. It was a weird experience, but I was getting a lot of relaxation through aggressive punk music. Do you know Ritalin? It's a drug prescribed to children with ADHD. I think the effect of this drug is maybe similar to the feeling I'm trying to describe. Kids with ADHD begin to calm down when they take Ritalin. On the other hand, if a non-ADHD person takes it, they become excited, hyper, and excessively energized. For me, for some reason, I feel something similar to meditation with aggressive music. Somehow it makes me feel very relaxed, Shields said. He also mentioned that he was under a huge influence of the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Ramones, Television, Dinosaur Jr. and The Cure. As Shields stated, with the Isn't Anything LP, they became the band they are today. It happened after he moved from being simply aggressive in music to placing emotion at the center of it. But their best album was still ahead.
Soft as snow but warm inside, penetrate you cannot hide.
By the end of the 80s, there are other bands merging with a similar musical approach.
The Leeds-based act Pale Saints was one of the pioneer shoegaze bands. They were influenced by jangle pop and bands such as Primal Scream. Their debut 1990 album, The Comforts of Madness, showed a clear departure from post-punk toward more dreamlike guitar textures that felt unmistakably shoegaze. Of course, psychedelia and 1960s influences are also present. This drawn-in feeling traces its roots back to the Velvet Underground and John Cale's musical style. Another English band that gained attention at the time was Lush, which released their debut EP Scar through 4AD in 1989. Their music was heavily influenced by Cocteau Twins style dream pop, as well as 1960s psychedelia and 1980s indie rock. Cocteau Twins released their most critically acclaimed record in 1990. Heaven or Las Vegas embodied everything the band had achieved up to the point. This was peak dream pop. The song structures leaned heavily on simple rhythms and airy guitars in the background. Elizabeth Fraser's echoing, high-pitched vocals sounded better than ever. It became absolutely clear that dream pop was about less noise and more melody, while shoegaze followed a different sonic approach. Oxford band Riot is considered a shoegaze classic. Formed in 1988 by guitarist Andy Bell and Mark Gardner, drummer Lawrence Colbert, and bassist Steve Carell, the band drew influence from My Bloody Valentine, Sonic Youth, and Spaceman 3. Still, they didn't think of themselves as a shoegaze band. My first reaction was like, this is another boring tag, Andy Bell said after hearing someone describe them that way. Even though the band used noisy textures, tremolo, and jangly guitars, the mood of their debut album Nowhere was different from My Bloody Valentines. In the opening track Seagull, you can hear the influence of the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows and 1960s psychedelia, just heavier and louder.
By 1991, almost every band mentioned earlier had fully formed its unique sound, and classic shoegaze was finally born. In 2016, Pitchfork published its list of the best shoegaze albums, placing Loveless at number 1. And it really is. This My Bloody Valentine album became the key moment for shoegaze and remains the band's absolute peak.
It's not surprising that Shields and Butcher developed tinnitus while recording it. There was a lot of noise. And the entire album was born out of experiments with guitars, feedback, and the very borders of sound. Shields mostly used the tremolo bar and the glide guitar technique, deliberately avoiding chorus and flanger pedals. For drums, the band relied on pre-recorded samples played by Kolmo Kishik, who was suffering from physical ailments during the sessions. It's also interesting that Shields cited Neil Young and The Cure as inspirations for the LP. He even claimed that they used fewer guitar tracks that many bands use on demo tapes. When you listen to When You Sleep, it's hard to tell guitar from a keyboard. Those strange, ghost-like melodies were created with guitars, as Shields played chords or single-note shapes while constantly moving the tremolo bar, causing the pitch to wobble microtonally. This became the defining sound of Loveless and the key invention of My Bloody Valentine, the band that made guitars sound otherworldly. The album didn't achieve major success immediately after its release. The band lost a lot of money, and Shields isolated himself in the studio, nearly completing a jungle album. My Bloody Valentine released their third album only 22 years later, by which time shoegaze had become even more popular than it was in the 1990s. Post-punk pioneers, Susie and the Banshees, were also connected to another shoegaze classic, Slowdive, which was named after one of their songs. Slowdive was formed in Berkshire in 1989 by two friends, Neil Halstead and Rachel Goswell. At first they played indie pop, but later completely changed their style. Slowdive quickly joined the ranks of shoegaze bands such as Catherine Wheel and Cranes, and somehow became the most hated band of the genre. Melody maker journalist Dave Simpson claimed he would rather drown in a bath full of porridge than listen to Slowdive. Time heals everything, and today the band's 1991 debut, Just for a Day, is considered a shoegaze classic. The album is beautiful, dreamy, sad, and ethereal. It clearly shares common ground with Cocteau Twins and space rock. Slowdive made quiet, muffled vocals a defining part of their style. Their guitar sound can also be described as the wall of sound, with heavy use of reverb and delay, making their songs feel like fairy tales. Slowdive were far ahead of their time, and alongside My Bloody Valentine, became one of the greatest shoegaze bands. Oxford-based Swervedriver took a different path. Their 1991 album Race perfectly demonstrated the influence of loud, dirty 1980s indie rock, especially Dinosaur Jr. From this point on, we can talk about two main shoegaze directions, one leaning toward the dreamy, hazy sound of My Bloody Valentine and Slowdive, and another leaning toward a rougher, less polished, garage-style heaviness represented by Slowdive, which also shares similarities with My Bloody Valentine's late 1980s EPs.
The rise of shoegaze and experience of My Bloody Valentine, Slowdive, Cocteau Twins, and Slowdive gave the scene a boost. In the first half of the 1990s, band after band released peak albums.
Moose, the same act that somehow was responsible for the term to be invented, released their debut LP XYZ in 1992. Their songs didn't have the same energy with My Bloody Valentine or Slowdive, but leaned more toward indie pop and indie rock psychedelia, having much in common with the 60s style, which was a defining element of the 1990s rock revival. The same year, Lush debuted with their first full-length album, Spooky. It contained 12 melody-driven and dreamy songs with a strong influence of Cocteau Twins. Catherine Will were adepts of huge and energetic sound with loud guitars and loud drums. This English band was associated with shoegaze scene with their early releases like 1992 Ferment, and soon after they started playing something closer to hard rock. Music trend changed. Even though there are some examples of commercial success in classic shoegaze like 1991 Chapter House debut album Whirlpool, the critics were kind of skeptical about shoegaze and switched to grunge and Britpop, the genres which almost killed shoegaze in the beginning of the 1990s. The arrival of Nirvana, Suede and Blur completely changed people's music taste, and while the first albums by Suede got praised by critics, the next releases by Slowdive were completely destroyed by toxic reviews, and Slowdive started changing their music approach. And it's interesting how The Verve first was a shoegaze band with their brilliant 1993 album Storm in Heaven, but then they became Britpop legends. It looked like the world wasn't ready for shoegaze yet, but 2000 cinema and later internet nostalgia changed everything.
It turned out that listeners in the 1990s weren't ready to fall in love with a new sort of 1960s psychedelia. They were more into a different kind of nostalgia, the one that romanticism and rock and roll-driven Britpop and the remastered hard rock version known as grunge would provide. So shoegaze was beaten once, but not defeated.
Of course, Slowdive, Cocteau Twins and the Jesus and Mary Chain had an impact on other bands, even on the other side of the ocean. As you may have noticed, the first wave of shoegaze was mostly England-based, and like Britpop, it was part of the legacy of the British Crown. But the next wave of British invasion did happen. When a Californian guy, Eric Shee, attended a Ride and Lush concert and was handed a flyer that said, "Band-seeking guitarist and singer, influences include Slowdive, Cocteau Twins and Lush," he met his future bandmates, who formed the obscure band Ozone, which released only one self-made EP back in 1993 and soon vanished. As happened to many other bands of the time, their second coming occurred only in the 2010s, when internet culture had prepared the soil with tons of My Bloody Valentine references, praising articles and iconic visuals, featuring murky, blurred, colorful, abstract photos. And even in the 1990s, there were many bands that got buried under other music waves. Take American bands Colfax Abbey, the Cotton Society, Texas-based Comet, and Should, Hum, who actually returned in 2020, or the Australian act The Earthmen, the lesser-known English band Loop from the 1980s, the brilliant American band Bowery Electric, Bristol-based Secret Shine, or Skywave, Blue Shift Signal, and many others. Shoegaze has been promoted in different media since the 1990s. American film director Greg Araki made it an integral part of his style. You can hear many classics in his 1997 drama Nowhere. It featured songs by Slowdive, Catherine Will, Lush, and the Jesus and Mary Chain. Araki incorporated shoegaze into his dreamy and hazy world of teenage drama, depression, and angst. At the same time, Wong Kar-wai's Chungking Express and Fallen Angels helped shape the vision of another cult American director, Sofia Coppola. Her debut, the version Suicides, had a strong impact on Tumblr's visual culture of the 2000s, and Kevin Shields recorded the score for her Lost in Translation. The film also featured several songs by My Bloody Valentine and the Jesus and Mary Chain, which introduced many people from a new generation to the genre. Because it came together with very specific visuals, shoegaze quickly became associated with dreamy urban shots, the melancholy of modern life, sadness, loneliness, and the desire to find love and care in a messy world. It resonated with the frustration of a new generation, shaped equally by 1990s TV culture and the early internet culture of the 2000s, with blogs and the first social media platforms. This new generation began learning from 1980s and 1990s shoegaze and even copying it. As mentioned before, Lost in Translation had a shoegaze-inspired score, and there was one particular song that helped form this new shoegaze vibe, Girls by Death in Vegas. This English band was formed by Richard Fearless in the 1990s. The track Girls, taken from LP Scorpio Rising, hinted at the new shoegaze revival. Sweden's The Radio Department marked a combination of light indie pop, dream pop, and shoegaze with their 2003 debut album Lesser Matters. Their humble sound and hazy guitars were an answer to loud electronic music and lingering grunge influences. Formed in 2001, the American band Asobi Sexo became a significant part of the new gaze movement. Their songs were performed in Japanese and arranged around energetic yet melodic guitars. I suppose the whole Japanese shoegaze boom of the 2000s and 2010s has something to do with this particular band. There are tons of shoegaze bands from Japan, seriously, and it's a subject worth digging into. I'll just mention a few acts and say something general about their popularity. Shoegaze in Japan began spreading in the 1990s when Western bands started giving concerts there. Since the end of World War II, Japan had been deeply influenced by Western culture, especially music, so shoegaze naturally found its place. With Tokyo clubs like Koenji High, the scene began to grow. First wave bands included Coulter of the Deepers and Boris, who mixed metal with dream pop aesthetics. Later, in the 2000s and 2010s, came a wave of bands such as Kineko Teikoku, Yuragi, My Dead Girlfriend, and many others. Soon, Japanese shoegaze became popular among fans in the USA and Europe, and this story came full circle. I suppose this happened partly because of Japan's cultural expansion, as part of its soft power, including anime, movies, music, and visual culture. It sounds exotic, not like something sung in English, and of course, that attracts people.
While the louder side of shoegaze influenced bands like Waves and No Age, a significant part of new gaze or 2010s shoegaze was inspired by romanticism aesthetics.
Texas-based Ringo Death Star was among the bands that helped draw renewed attention to shoegaze. Their self-titled EP in 2007 and their 2009 release marked the rising wave of new gaze. Around the same time, on the cusp of the 2000s and 2010s, bands like Weeknd, Weir, and The Pains of Being Pure at Heart emerged. If you were into indie rock, you probably listened to most of them. It was a time when many new listeners discovered shoegaze and, along with these new bands, its roots. The Pains of Being Pure at Heart was one of the most successful acts of the new shoegaze wave. They combined indie rock and shoegaze on their brilliant 2011 album Belong, which achieved commercial success and charted in both the US and Europe. It's hard to define their style as shoegaze, but they definitely borrowed something from it, especially its guitar sound, and used it in a more conventional way. You can easily say the same about many of the shoegaze bands of the 2010s and 2020s. Basically, the genre's definition has become so broad that it sometimes sparks heated debates among fans over whether a particular band can really be called shoegaze or if they're just a bunch of posers. In the 2010s, shoegaze stopped being just a revival genre and quietly dissolved into other styles. Its hazy guitars, blurred textures, and emotional distant vocals became part of modern dream pop, especially in bands like Beach House and Dive. Shoegaze also seeped into alternative R&B. Artists such as Frank Ocean and The Weeknd embraced washed-out production, reverb-heavy spaces, and emotional detachment that felt closer to My Bloody Valentine than to classic soul. The lo-fi textures used by artists like Clairo echo shoegaze's idea that imperfection and atmosphere can be more powerful than clarity. When Deaf Heaven combined black metal with post-rock and shoegaze, the term black gaze emerged. In the 2020s, shoegaze became a significant part of internet visual culture. It continues to inspire countless bands around the world, and maybe now is the best time for the genre. As for my personal top 3, it's definitely Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. This album is so important and defining, and it sounds like nothing else. Easily, when you speak of shoegaze, it comes straight to mind. Next is Souvlaki by Slowdive. This music is so touching and deep, maybe the most beautiful shoegaze album, feeling very personal and dreamy. I'm proud that I had a chance to see Slowdive live. Bauer Electric's self-titled album is my personal jam. I think it's a little underrated.
So, thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to my Instagram and TikTok pages, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.